What is going on, everyone? Welcome to the ever-evolving, never-ending Ready, Set podcast. All right, so before we get into it, just a few quick reminders. Don't forget to check out the interview we did with John Gusty from Red Pill Revolution. That is up on the YouTube page. If you'd like to check it out, we on audio. We are on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or wherever you may find your podcasts. Let's also. Oh yeah, I always forget to say this too. Don't forget to go to Facebook, check out the Ready Said podcast page, give it a like, leave a comment, tell me what you think, or if you're really feeling engaged, you can email the podcast at readysaidpodcast@gmail.com. All right, so this one this week is going to be a little bit different. It's not going to be news, it's not going to be culture. I guess this is going to be more of a story time, if you will. So I want to take you back to, I guess we're going back to about, 2003, 2004? Yep, it's 2003, 2004, okay. And I had a friend back then who was kind of, we were in a band together. And if you watch the Gusty interview, again, available here on YouTube for video and audio if you want to check it out on Spotify, iHeartRadio podcasts, or Google Podcasts, it is available. I mentioned that I was in a band with a gentleman, and his name was Mark Traro. He's a great guitar player. Actually, I'll show you a few of his moves, if you will. But we'll get into that in just one second. Now, when we were in a band together, unfortunately, the technology that exists today didn't really exist. If we wanted to, record on video, we have to use a handheld video camera. iPhones weren't around yet. We were doing open mics in 2005, and I'd have to set up a video camera, and I didn't even know how to get it onto the internet. I mean, I guess back then you could upload that shit to your MySpace account, but I don't even know if MySpace I didn't use it that much to even know. And that part of life that was so common nowadays, it was fairly new. It was very new, and no one really knew, especially someone like me, who is technology retarded, didn't understand the reach that you could get by using those, and neither did we. So a lot of those tapes probably ended up getting recorded over by my sister. They were never uploaded to a server. But I will say my experience with Mark and the guys that were in our band was I had a lot of access to an audio interface. That's how we used to record. So when I moved over to podcasts, I realized, oh, this is like what we were doing when we recorded stuff, except instead of a microphone and a guitar, I just have to worry about the microphone. Pretty easy stuff. And we'll probably be doing a podcast about setting up a podcast very soon. Thank you to the gentleman that threw that down in the comments in a few videos ago. Appreciate that, sir. So anyway, back to the story at hand. So I met Mark when he was 15 and I was 19, and we started a band, and we wrote original songs. He wasn't really into covers back then. I wanted to do covers, but that just wasn't what he was about. So we ended up writing 4 or 5 songs. I did the lyrics and the music. He did a lot of some of the music too. Most of the licks that went over a lot of the rhythm, if you will. And we put out like a little demo thing called Truth. It had 5 songs on it. The physical copies are still out there somewhere. I think the digital copy of it is on a laptop somewhere. But these songs do exist out there in the ether somewhere. And Mark was dating this girl, Kimmy, at the time. And, they dated just like anyone would when they were that young. And he was also that guy that when he would get a girlfriend, he'd disappear. You wouldn't hear from the guy unless he needed something from you, right? So what Mark ends up doing is he ends up breaking up with Kimmy for her best friend, Olivia, okay? It's the switch, essentially. He pulled off the switch, the non-roommate switch from Seinfeld, And then with Olivia, she was an interesting girlfriend of his because her parents were doing okay, if you will. I think her dad was an architect. So there was, some money floating around where the other girlfriend, I think her dad died while they were dating. And there's a label you could apply to her, but I'm not going to do that because, we still have some, we talk here and there. And I don't want to be mean, but, there was definitely a social class difference between the two girls. So Mark ends up dating Olivia, and that he kind of disappears. Back then, if I wanted to hear from Mark, I'd have to call him. Generally, his it would go to voicemail, and I'd be like, "Hey, Mark, I got a lot of weed and no one to smoke it with. Why don't you come by?" And then usually within the hour, I get a phone call from him, and he'd be on the way over. Was I simping for Mark? Just a little bit, but this is 20 years ago, also, and I just wanted him to come over and play. So anyway, he dates Olivia. Time goes by, don't hear from him. Sometimes I make this offer, don't hear from him. The truth of the matter is, dude started kind of getting into coke a little bit, and that was probably the other reason why he disappeared. And lo and behold, one day, one of my friends in this group tells me, "Hey, did you hear about Mark?" And I said, "No, what's going on, Mark?" And they go, "Mark ran away with his girlfriend from Florida to Florida. They ran away." And now, again, that doesn't sound like a big deal, but he was 18 and she was 16, 17. She was underage. Now, I'm going to take a quick break here because I kind of skipped over something really quick. Actually, I'm going to get to that in a minute. So this was the story that Mark told me. So what happened is I hear Mark ran away to Florida with an underage girl, which, I mean, is not what it sounds like. She was 17, he was 18, but you can't cross state lines with a minor. I believe that has to do with the Mann Act is what that one is. But, again, we're going into the weeds here. So that was kind of like, whoa, what the fuck is Mark doing, taking a minor across state lines? And I didn't really hear of the story beyond that until I think I heard that he had come back about a year later, and I called him and we hung out, and that's kind of when I discovered the dude was on coke. And the story was I called him up, and I built a bar in the basement, and I was just sitting down there one night. I'm like, what? And this is what happened. I randomly just think of Mark and be like, you know what? I'm going to call this son of a bitch. So I call him up, and I remember leaving a message, it goes right to voicemail, par for the course. And I remember saying, "Hey, Mark, what's going on? It's Joe. I haven't spoken to you in so long. I've got a lot of weed and no one to smoke it with. Hopefully you call me back." And then within maybe 5-10 minutes, he called me back. And I remember him, kind of sounding like a kid that got in trouble because this is the first time I had talked to the guy since he had run away to Florida, essentially. And he asked me, "Hey, is it all right if my girlfriend comes by too," which was Olivia. And I was like, "Yeah, sure, that's not a problem." And I think I had asked him if he wanted to jam maybe, which, the story behind that was we were in a band. His girlfriend kind of went away, and we hung out, played a lot, and then she came back, and basically I just was reduced to someone that can give him and his girlfriend a ride somewhere while we can play guitar in between all of that. And then when he got his license, I was basically cast aside. And then that's kind of where the era of me randomly reaching out to Mark and stuff like that would take place. But I mean, I maybe see him once every 4 months, maybe. I think after he got his license, I didn't see him for a long time. But okay, anyway. So this is one of those days I just randomly called him. He ends up showing up. Okay, it was kind of a rare occurrence, and he comes by. Dude's fucking coked out of his fucking brains. He's shaking. He's all nervous. Maybe he's nervous because it's the first time he had seen me. I don't know. I'm not. Why would anyone be nervous around me? I'm not like a volatile person. Am I? So he comes by, we're talking, he's shaking a little bit, and, he explains to me, what was going on and why he was the way he was. He's probably a little embarrassed about it. It's fine, whatever. It is, do you, bro. Years later, he ends up telling me that what happened is him and Olivia were sitting in a bowling alley, fiending for anything, coke, weed, whatever they could find. And they had called everybody because this is how it worked back then. If you wanted to find weed or coke, even, I guess. I mean, I've never looked for coke, but if you wanted to find weed, you had to know someone. You had to call someone. You had to have access to them. And if you didn't, you had to call someone that would know someone. And back then, it's not like it is now where they're like, "Oh yeah, here's my buddy, give him a call." Like, no, that's not how it worked. You didn't know who was who. The DEA would come out of the corner, so it was a very closed network. And if you didn't have an in, there would be nights where you were just on the phone trying to, calling people you haven't talked to in years, be like, "Yo, can you set me up?" Kind of shit like that. So anyway, he's in one of these modes with his girlfriend, and they're about to give up. And then his phone rings, and he sees it's me, and he's like, "Well, I'm not dealing with that." I leave him that message, and so he comes over. So we're playing. So we're talking, shooting the shit. He's telling me all this stuff. And then I don't remember if he asked me if I wanted to jam. I think it was me that asked that. So we started jamming. And that's when Olivia goes, "Mark, you play the guitar?" And I remember being like, You didn't tell her you play the guitar. And again, he's good. And we're going to get to that in a second. I promise you we'll show you something there. I'm even on it. It's one of the songs we played. I'm only going to play it for a few seconds, minute. We'll see. Maybe I'll let it breathe. Maybe. We'll see. So anyway, trying to get this done here under 30. So I'm a third way through here. So we play. She's blown away by these songs that we had played. Because I mean, remember, this is about 2-3 years later from when we put out that demo, and we're still playing these songs. I mean, again, we were a little rusty, but the chemistry we had, like, she was just like, it almost seems like you guys have been playing this the whole time, and I know you haven't because he's been with me for the last 2 years, and she didn't even know he played the guitar. So anyway, that's kind of what it was like with Mark. It was very sporadic over the years. So you fast forward, like, I think it was like 4 or 5 years later, now we're working together at a California Pizza Kitchen. We're both servers, living out in, I was out in an apartment by myself, and I think he was working at another location, but we were still in constant contact, and every so often he'd come over to the house, or to the apartment. And finally one day I asked him, like, what the fuck happened with Olivia? And he ended up telling me the whole story. So I'm going to try to tell you the story through the information that he gave me, but repurposed, you know what I mean? Because he used to tell me, when people would ask him about Florida, he would always just tell them, like, just go ask Joe. He tells the story a lot better. All right, so this is the story. Do I want to go into the story? Okay, let's do this. Before we get into this story, let's take a little video of, this is Mark and I. Now notice, I cut this part of my head off, and I did that for a specific reason. Did you all think you were going to get a look under this hat through some cheap video that was made 8 years ago, actually? Because this is like January 15th, 2015. No, you're not. It's not. You weren't going to get it that easy. You probably thought you were, but you're not. All right, so I'm going to play this. This is a song Mark and I wrote. It's called A Dirty Sin. I wrote the lyrics. I want to say he wrote the music, but I might be wrong about that. Okay, wait, I remember now. He wrote the music, but I have I've made the more updated version of it. This song, if I were to play it right now, the lyrics would be the same, but there are some parts of it that have changed. Not by much, but, enough where this song is clearly mine now. All right, so let's play this and just get an idea. You'll see I'm playing the rhythm, and Mark's just doing the lead licks over the rhythm. All right, let's go. Maybe I should let this play in the background. Let it breathe. Yeah, let's do that. All right. Actually, it was. I'm not gonna lie. Let's listen to this really quick. It was a little rough in the beginning when we played this. Because he's trying. You can see he's trying to find. We never really played this song like this before. This is probably one of the first times in years we had played. So I'm not screaming over my lyrics here. And you can see he's just trying to find something that works here. It took a little bit, but eventually he found something. But just, I'm going to let it breathe, listen to what he does, and you'll see what I mean. He's a good guitar player. My guitar playing is a little suspect here. Again, it's the first time playing a little bit. Well, fun fact, I wrote these lyrics while I was on a cruise. That dirty sin. Alright, here we go. See, he's jamming. Now he's getting it. See, we were tight, I'm telling you. It's the first time we'd played this song in a while, but he knew that rest was coming up. Alright, let's see if I can knock this down a little bit. This is a new verse that I had written probably a week prior to us playing this. Alright. We're going to go back to this in a minute, maybe. We'll see. Okay. So I'm sure all of you want to know the story. What happens? Okay, so this is how Mark told it to me. He said him and Olivia's parents went out of town for a weekend, and they decided to throw a party at her house. And there was booze, weed, probably some of that other stuff. And Mark tells me that he had to move a car out of the garage. I think it was his car because I don't think she had a car. I don't remember. He had to move. I think it was his car out of not the driveway, the garage. And when he was backing the garage up, when he was backing the car up, he hit the track the garage sits on, and that's kind of a bonehead move a little bit. And obviously, that is not something I assume is cheap to fix. So this created a little bit of a riff, and not with Olivia, but with Olivia's parents. And her parents were like, "You can't see Mark anymore." Well, what do you think happened there? She immediately was like, "We're running away to Florida." And Mark's like, "How are we going to do that? We have no money." And she goes, "Oh, there's money here. We just got to find it." Apparently, her dad had some library. Yeah, this wasn't a small house. And there was money he would stash in there. So I remember him telling me they would just take books and just, wiggle them out. And then finally, like, $2,000 came flying out of a book or something like that. Or they opened a book, there was $2,000. And they decided, we're going to take this money and we're moving to Florida, So he tells me they went and copped some weed. They went to Subway, got some sandwiches, started smoking, and headed out. And he goes, "We were in the middle of Indiana somewhere, and we get pulled over by a police officer. And we just started we just finished smoking. So, they're done. They're done, son, Weed and everything." Excuse me. So, I guess the cop comes up, has a conversation, and it's like, "Yeah, I'm just going to have the dog walk around the car." And so they said, "That's fine." The dog walks around, and it comes over to Olivia's side of the car on the passenger side and starts barking at her. Now, the side note here is, I guess what was happening was she was wearing a hoodie. She had the weed in her pocket right here, but the Subway they had stopped at also was, she had that sandwich in that hoodie pocket right there. So when the dog started barking, the cop was like, the first thing she did, and I have to say this is instinctively good, was she pulled the Subway out of her pocket and said, "I think this is what he's barking at." And the cop took it like hook, line, and sinker, bitch. And he let him go. And they were free to continue on to Florida, and probably at a much safer pace is my assumption. And I remember Mark telling me as they kind of got, past the Georgia-Florida border, he goes, because they left in the middle of winter. So, like, they went from, being like 10, 20 degrees to watching the temperature slowly go up the further south that they went. And I remember him telling me how, he's like, it was the greatest feeling ever, knowing it was just getting warmer the further south we went. And coming from two kids that had been stuck in Chicago their whole lives, it's I can understand where he was coming from there. And then obviously when I drove out to Phoenix a few years later, it was the middle of the winter, and I totally understood what he was saying, especially as you get into Arizona and it's a nice crisp 60 degrees there. So they end up going to Arcadia, Florida. They decide what we're going to do is we're going to live on a campground, buy a tent, and we're just going to live our lives that way. Nothing wrong with that, right? I believe that's how homeless people start, but whichever, I digress. So they're doing this, and that's their day-to-day life, and I guess it becomes obvious, hey, we have a limited supply of money. We need to make it so this money kind of carries over and keeps coming in. So what Mark does is finds a job at Arby's, is what it was. And he gets the job and starts going to work. And I don't think it was maybe a day or two into his working where, think about it. He's been spending all of his time with his girlfriend, and now he's got to get up and go to work. And he's probably working, a 6, 7, 8 hour shift, and she's 17. And again, this is 2003. Smartphones didn't exist. I went to go reach for my phone. The smartphones don't exist. You know what I mean? Like, you have cell phones, but they're not what they are today. You see like the old people with the flip phones, like that's what phones were back then. They were flip phones. Like, go watch a movie from that era, 2003 to before because the Razor changed the flip phone game. So, but if you watch movies up to, like, I think the flip phone, that Razor came out in 2005, so anything 2003, 2004-ish, you'll see people have, like, Motorola cell phones. I mean, watch Entourage. Like, that first season or two, he's got one of those little Motorola cell phones. Like, that's what people had back then. There weren't games on it. There wasn't the internet. You could barely text on those things. So she gets bored. And what does she do? She calls her friend, okay? Now, I think the only person they had been in contact prior to Olivia reaching out to her friends was the guy that was the bass player in our band. Guy is what we called him, and we'll refer to him as Guy, or Guy reading a book, if you will. And that probably means absolutely nothing to most people, but that's kind of an inside joke and a little hint to his name. Guy reading a book. So we're going to call him Guy. So they call up Guy, and they tell Guy what's going on. Guy, we're in Florida. I think it was Arcadia, Florida, where they were at, actually. And explains to Guy that, Mark's working at Arby's. We have this campsite. This is what we're doing. We're alive. We're okay. And no need to worry. I hope that's not passive-aggressive. So I guess Olivia reaches out to one of her friends and, I'm a little bored. I'm lonely. Mark's at work, blah, blah, blah. It's, from what Mark told me, the second she hung up with her friends, they immediately called her parents and let them know, hey, we talked to Olivia. We think she's here, and that's where you can find her. Go get her, please. I don't know if they said that, but they were being good friends and letting her parents know, who were probably worried about her, where to go find their daughter. So I guess Eric somehow gets involved because nobody knew Eric knew where they were. So I think someone, maybe Olivia's parents, maybe even Mark's mom, now that I think about it, reached out to Eric to ask him about this. And I think Guy, they reached out to Guy, and I think he pled, like, I don't know anything, because that's Guy. He probably knows a lot, tells you he knows nothing. And now he's got to call Mark to give him a heads up about what's going on, because they are on their way to Arcadia with the police, I believe, because that's the situation. They didn't know what they were walking into, both parties, really. So Mark's working at Arby's, doing his thing, working at Arby's, and all of a sudden, the manager comes up to Mark and says, hey, Mark, you have a phone call. Again, cell phones weren't what cell phones are today. You got to remember this. People had cell phones, but it's just the cell phone culture today didn't translate to what it was 20 years ago. And if you weren't alive back then, I don't really know how to explain it to you. Like, you can't just pick up your phone. Like, those phones back then weren't made to just sit there and stare at, And maybe Mark didn't have his phone. Phones were really new. Businesses didn't really want you having them and being distracted, I think. Either way, he didn't have his cell phone on him. Maybe he gave it to Olivia. That'd be my guess, actually. So Guy calls him at Arby's, and I remember Mark telling me, when the manager told me I had a phone call, I knew something was up, because nobody knows me here. The only person that knew that I worked here was Olivia and Guy. So Guy gets on the phone. He's like, what did he say? He goes, Sire, I think is what he used to call Mark. There's a bunch of nicknames. It was Sire. He's like, they know where you guys are at, and you need to get the fuck out of there for whatever reason, So Mark tells me, this is how Mark's mind works. He doesn't just leave work. He sits around for the rest of his shift stewing about the fact that Olivia broke this pact that they have, or more importantly, gave away where they were. Again, they weren't trying to hide, but he also was aware I crossed state lines with an underage female, again, 17, but he's 18, 19 at the time. It's not that bad, but still, you're not supposed to do it. So he gets back to the campsite, and they realize that they have to leave. They got to go because they are on their way. And I remember him telling me, he's like, we didn't take the tent down. We didn't, organize anything. They literally just they took everything out of the tent and shoved it all in the back of his Honda Civic. But then they realize, hey, we got a second problem here. We just paid 2 weeks up front for this campsite, and we have no money to go anywhere else. What are we going to do? Well, this is where Olivia comes in, because I guess she goes into that front office there and gives Mark, and this is what I remember Mark telling me, he gives them the sob story and all. She's crying, tears. My aunt died. I need the money. Either way, I don't remember the specifics of it. I mean, he told me this story a long time ago. I have the note somewhere, but I do remember him telling me, like, she sobbed, like, turned on the waterworks in a way where he didn't even realize, like, whoa, she's capable of this? So the company capitulates, gives them their money back, I believe in cash, if anything. And they got the hell out of Dodge. And I remember the way he was telling me about all of this. In my mind, the way this was going down is like, they're packing the car up, and as they're packing the car up, the parents are meeting the police and discussing where they might be. And as they're going into the office, they're making their way to the campsite, as they're begging and crying and pleading for this money back because they have this family emergency they need to go to. The police and the parents are just encroaching on this spot, whittling the space between the both of them, down further and further and further. And finally they capitulate. They give them their money back and they get out of Dodge. And from what Mark told me after the fact, I believe the parents and the police ended up showing up like minutes after they left. Minutes. Like, I mean, it was fairly close. I think that's why I remember it kind of playing out like a movie, the way he was telling the story. And Mark wasn't a great storyteller, so I was probably doing that all, in my head, obviously. But I remember him specifically saying, like, after the fact, when they talked to the parents and, blah, 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 it was discovered that, like, they had left minutes prior to them getting there. Like, that's how close they were. So what do? I'll never forget this. Mark tells me they just started driving. They didn't know where to go. Mark was not happy. They had set something up. They were all ready to go. They had built this little life for them, and albeit a hybrid homeless / non-homeless person life, but hey, it's a life, right? This cord is not working with me. So they keep driving, and I remember him saying, we were just aimlessly driving, trying to find a place to live, and we end up driving past this road called Seven Dwarfs. And, this is right by Disney, he said. And he goes, there was something about that just, they had this feeling of calm come over them. And, they eventually were able to find a hotel because if you go to, I know where that road is, Seven Dwarves. It's off of 192, not too far from Disney. And that road, it's called John Young Park. It's called Vineland Avenue. Bronson or it's got like 5 different names. The Earl Bronson Memorial Highway, 192 Vineland, whatever. It's this big artery. I've talked about it here on the podcast during the Disney one that runs east to west that borders Osceola and Orange County. And it's basically that one major road that separates Disney, on the counties, from the Orange County side and the Osceola County side. And that's what this road is on. And leading up to Disney, this road is it's all hotels because prior to Disney building all of the resorts, those are the only places you could stay if you couldn't get in at the Polynesian, the Contemporary, or whatever the fuck that was around. And then Eisner came around and kind of made it so everyone stays in the Disney bubble. But leading up to that, there were a lot of hotels that sprouted up around. And now there's not really a market for these hotels unless you're someone from England who doesn't know how to use Google Maps. Most of these people that use these hotels are like borderline homeless people, people that live in a hotel for whatever reason. That's what the market is for most of these hotels. And that's who Mark and Olivia were perfect for. So they end up staying at this place called the Sun Inn Suites, which ended up not being too far from where I used to live when I moved down here about 10 years ago, which I thought that was fucking hilarious because in a way I ran away from Florida. And in a nice little connection here, where's the video, when we filmed this was probably a week before I moved here to Florida. You know what I mean? So, in a way, we were all running away from something, right? I just didn't have an underage girl with me at the time. Okay. So, geez, excuse me. um, so they end up in essentially Kissimmee, Florida, and I just remember at this point their life just became about I don't. Mark went and got a job at a temp service that would just assign him to go dig a ditch somewhere, and then they met some guy from Chicago named Payne, and he had some connections around here to whichever illicit product you shall desire. I'm sure everyone can guess which two I'm talking about. And that became his life. I remember Mark kind of explaining to me like we'd go to some sketchy ass neighborhoods to buy stuff, and I remember explaining like that he's like you would see these apartments that would just have these like doors that were open, and there'd be all these guys sitting in them, and they'd be like, "Oh no, come over here," And after when he would tell me the story, I was like, "What kind of ghetto is this?" But after living here for so long, I realized like, okay, well, first of all, you gotta understand, Mark's an anxious dude. Like this guy has anxiety that rivals anxiety. And should I side note on this story? Let me just finish this. So he's an anxious guy, and when he can become overwhelmed with emotion, and even in the most benign situations. Okay, case in point, Mark has a tendency to pass out when he becomes overly anxious. Let's see. There's two stories that I like here. We're over 30 minutes. All right, I'll do them quick. So he is on a motorcycle with Guy after a coke binge for like 3 or 4 days. Guy drags him out of the house, puts him on the Goldwing. The Goldwing's a motorcycle that has a front seat, back seat. And Mark's anxious, remember, and he don't like motorcycles. When we were in the band, we used to ride that Goldwing, and Mark would just ride in the car, and me and Eric would take the bike, and I'd ride bitch because, whatever. I like the bike. It's fun shit. It's exciting. Not so much for Mark. So anyway, the Goldwing was the only ride. So Mark gets on the bike, and I remember him, Guy, explaining to me years later that, he was riding the bike. All of a sudden, he just feels this dead weight in the back of the bike, and he looks behind him, and there's Mark flopping like a fish. And he's like, I couldn't balance the bike anymore, and it fell over. And Mark passed out. Some lady saw this happen in front of her house. She calls the police, but, they just took Mark away in an ambulance, and he was fine. The other one was a 4th of July of like 2007, I want to say, and he hit a DUI checkpoint. Now, he said he was drinking at a 4th of July barbecue, but we're talking, 6, 7 beers over the course of, 8 hours. He was there for a long time. An hour, 1 hour per beer isn't going to bring you over the limit. But remember, he's an anxious guy. So when the cop walks up to the car, he's visibly nervous, so that's a red flag for a police officer right there. He's kind of fumbling. They asked him how much did he have to drink. He explains to them, I had something to drink. Like, hey, can you pull your car on over there? The anxiety became so much for the guy, he ended up passing out. Now, normally that's not a big deal, but he didn't put the car in, he was in the middle of putting the car into drive from park, and then when he passed out, his foot hit the gas. So he said he was passed out. He doesn't remember it, but what he was told is that the car zoomed off as the cop was walking in front of it, so the cop had to dive out of the way. So immediately they're like, we got a runner! And the car just drove off into a ditch, and he was fine, but the car was totaled. And when he told me this story, I tried my hardest not to laugh, but it was hard not to laugh at that one because the dude's fucking anxious. So that's kind of where all that anxiety would come from, when he would try to, it probably wasn't as bad as what he was making it out to seem. I live here. You go to some of these apartment complexes, they don't look the greatest, but it's not like walking around the south side of Chicago either. Like the ghettos here in Florida are a little bit different than what you find in these like giant urban centers. And that's kind of a hard thing to explain to a lot of people because, it's just different. It's the South. It's different. So anyway, I remember him telling me this. It would be a big thing for him to go to these places. And then finally one day, he's like, we were playing baseball. We were playing basketball in the hotel. A lot of these hotels have all these amenities. And this car pulls up. And next thing you know, the two people that get out are Olivia's parents. And they're like, oh, hey, guys, what's going on? And they're like, oh, hey, what's up? They're like, do you mind if we like talk to you guys for a little bit? And they're like, yeah, sure. Like, let's go into our little hotel room here. I remember Mark saying, he's like, we walk in and immediately we're trying to like hide the coke, the weed, from the parents, which they probably were aware of what was going on. They knew, I'm sure it was not that big of a surprise, but I guess what had happened is Olivia's dad hired after probably realizing that they were long gone and they were gonna have to start from square one all over again. They decided to get a private detective involved, private investigator, excuse me. And all he did was ran Mark's social security number, and then I guess when Mark was in that temp service, it popped up. This social security number was run through this temp agency, and then I assume they went to the temp agency, got an address, and knew where to find them. So I just remember him saying the whole thing ended kind of with his parents. We just wanted to make sure everything was okay. The dad wasn't upset with Mark because all Mark was trying to do was provide for the daughter, essentially. He ran the social security number. He had 2 jobs, and prior to this, Mark didn't work. So, the guy was trying at least. You can't be mad at someone for that. And I mean, plus, like, if we're all being honest, Mark isn't really known to, kind of lead anything. Olivia was probably leading most of this, and I'm sure the parents knew that, so hard to be mad at him. He didn't steal the $2,000. Olivia did. So he basically told me they just got to drive. They just drove back to Illinois, and that was that. I don't remember that relationship lasting too much longer after that, but it did, I guess, and then eventually it ended. Honestly, I can't remember that far back to like how or why it ended, but I know it didn't really last too much longer after that. And yeah, Mark running away to Florida was definitely, that was one of those stories that I remember hearing this. I should probably look at my notes again because when he told me this, I wrote down all these notes because I'm like, I'm gonna turn this into something. Maybe all these years later, it ended up just being a podcast about it. But it's very interesting, how the minds of teenagers work and what they think they need to do to take the right steps. But I guess, when you're in your early 20s, your late teens, these are the mistakes you have to make to kind of understand like what you have to do to actually be successful in life. All right, so we're going to play this in the background here. Yeah, just let it breathe for a second here. Let this breathe. Go back to look at that bad guitar playing. All right, well, that's going to do it for us this week, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. This is definitely a personal story of mine. I really like sharing these kind of stories with everyone. So I turn this down just a little bit more here. Listen to that lead. Let's go back to this really quick. The man could play an axe. I will say he might have some questionable decision making, but the man, he can play. And this is 8 years ago. This is 8 years ago. He's probably a lot better now. Fuck if I know. Dude hasn't called me in 5 years. Won't take my phone calls anymore. Maybe we'll have to do a podcast about that. All right, everyone. I'm going to leave you with some of this, and we'll see you next time. Have a good one, you fucks.
Again,